collectively, new forms of collectivity, which would no longer function through the old role of executive sovereignty. Okay? And this is one of the things that Foucault himself theorized too, to some degree. It was the way that we take governmentality over ourselves. The art of governmentality must be applied on an ethical and personal and not only individual but sub-individual level of our collective life and so forth, is that if we begin to act and to invent and to create new forms of self-power, new arts of self-government, new ethics of doing, that this will, in a sense, eventually bypass all of that popular form of sovereignty. So what you're referring to is, I would say, a solution of a leftist theory in the 70s to the problem always of popular imagination or a popular sovereignty. That, in a sense, the left could never convince the popular imagination that, in a sense, to not stop believing in its boogeymen and ghosts and phantoms, and in a sense, and so it began to, in a sense, just abandon, I'd say, the left. That's when the left abandoned the people, and began to, in a sense, dream of a body that would produce a form of life and a form of collectivity that no longer had a head, no longer had an executive function, or another way of saying it, no longer needed a state, no longer needed all of the trappings, in a sense, of modern power. The problem with those theories, say HoTE and Negri is an example, particularly of automatism in the Italian social thought. Deleuze and Guattari is another example, and I have written, 5-6 books on Deleuze and Guattari, and have been accused of being Deleuzian. But I've always been extremely critical of, in a sense, and I've always been trying to be very accurate about that was a historical decision of a certain kind of left in the countries like France and Italy that now has emerged in the United States and may no longer apply to the situation. But what I would say very simply, that 9/11 and the current global wars that have emerged that are still operated by the United States have transformed everything. And the Spinozist dream of a multitude, of an absolute democracy emerging no longer under the power of a sovereignty is very troubling. That's why, in one way, I would say that Agamben should be accredited with, in a sense, returning to the notion that sovereignty, the return of an older or archaic notion of sovereignty, is the one that needs to be reinserted into the current theories of power, which had earlier on abandoned it in a utopian form. Okay?
I have a question about the role of language vis-a-vis power. And specifically, since you bring up the 70s, how are you thinking about the role of Pierre Bourdieu in relationship to your read of Foucault today?
How,
Well, I'm thinking about language and symbolic power. It hasn't come up at all in your analysis, and I'm just curious as to why, since Pierre Bourdieu talked about it. Judith Butler in the United States has talked about that. And then the idea that everything is so mechanized that you lose sight of the head. And I'm wondering if actually language exists, or the use of language, or how people use language is actually something that would contradict or deny what you might be arguing.
well, I mean, I'm not sure that language exists in the head necessarily. I mean, certainly it's a question of the brain. But I wouldn't say that the symbol of language would be absent. It's just in a longer version of what I would give. We would talk about, in a sense, the issue of the role of language in any kind of executive decision, in the one who speaks. And even speaking itself as a situation of the way, or the symbol of decision, had taken a linguistic form, which is very old. The decree, the judgment, the statement or judgment made by a judge in a court. Those forms of language that are given symbolic authority. The question I was asking is, in a sense, what are the new symbols that we use today in order to represent those forms of decisions? And I would say that language is often, symbols of language is used less and less. As an example, in what way does civil society and the role of language and media and so forth, and political speech in civil society seems to have lost a lot of its performativity or effectivity in at least current theories of power, which have moved more to cybernetic and different kinds of symbols in trying to explain how communication happens today. So I would say that I would actually return to precisely that, to the notion of enunciation, to the notion of subjective enunciation, of language, of the symbols of language, and reinvest that with importance again. But that would be another kind of talk, I think, than the one that I gave here, which was mute. I was only talking about the symbol as something that precedes our image of what the decision is in an organic way, the way we represent to ourselves how we make decisions, normally.
In that case, and I need to not stay mute in that sense, but how do you see Donna Haraway then within this conversation?
In what way? Can you kind of point me to?
Because you were talking about language and you were talking about the cybernet and the scientific, and she often alludes to that. So
Yeah.
you bring her
I wouldn't situate her really in direct in relationship to the problems of sovereignty that I've been addressing that mostly I was taken up in other theories.
Okay.
So when I refer to the cybernetic, I'm speaking of a lot of times the new materialist theories that are emerging, but also ways that we represent how power functions. We often use notions of network and relay and connection in cybernetic language than we use that is a mathematical or a language of algorithms in order to understand that. I think that Haraway's work is addressing something in this problem of sovereignty that I've been trying to focus on, and in fact is beyond it to address in a sense more modes of collectivity and interspecies relations. So in a sense, what is the function of speech? You have to, within interspecies relationships, speech no longer is a dominant manner in which that situate one species to another. There's different modes of interaction that have to be heightened in that relationship. Yeah, I would say that's a much more positive way of approach. I remember the topic of my talk tonight, I apologize everybody, was thanapolitics, right? Which is the image of, would be the image of the camp, or it would be the image of an executive decision, but it really is an image of war. A lot of my work in the last 5 or 6 years has been involved with the Perpetual Peace Project and other projects of trying to reassert the fact that we're not talking enough about war in a time that we're in a series of repeated wars in our contemporary age. And so what I do when I'm asked to give a talk, I apologize, is I bring that issue up and just try to get us to think about it collectively. Yes?
I wonder if we've gotten, if I'm grasping this correctly, if we've gotten to a point where the sovereign is unable to regulate these unregulatable things. And by unregulatable things, I mean, banks and lightning trading and day trading and automated trading on stock exchanges, which have flash crashes, and
Power grids.
Power grids collapsing, and even you can get it down to Second Amendment enthusiasts who believe that they should be able to carry weapons everywhere and fear the camp totally, and they become unregulatable, so that the government or the sovereign himself or herself, in the case of Elizabeth Warren, is constantly having to chase after these things, trying to block them, and they keep filtering into these interstitial areas that are unable to be regulated. I mean, is that going in the direction of what you're talking about?
Well, that's fairly paranoid vision, I would say. But I'm just teasing. But yes, if we extend this, keep on extending these crashes and these micro crashes and these cataclysmic crashes of the stock market and the financial network, yes, you could say that there are micro decisions constantly, the way we speak about this, instantaneous decisions that are being made by a program or an algorithm that's created. But there is a class of those, or there are those that still make the decision to use that algorithm in the sense to speed up the training process because it yields a certain result, even if it threatens the entire system with a crash.
So we're willing to live with, I guess in the state of exception, and we're willing to live with this system that's constantly on the edge of crashing.
Yeah.
And that we've just gotten to that point where we're like, well, you know, things are going to crash, grids are going to collapse, and then we just have to deal with it.
Well, and this is what concerns me, as I said before, because I think there is a certain symbol of decision that is a paradigmatic collective decision that would be that moment of the system crashing, or we reach a point where that decision is constantly happening, that shapes and conditions our own organic judgment about that system and representation of that system, that we actually come to accept that as a non-political, something that we can intervene in, as a non-political question, that the decision has no juridical status. That's basically, it's just like nuclear war. The decision of certain superpowers to have the authority to wield nuclear weapons was a decision made not through any constitutional authority, not through any juridical authority, not through any political authority that everyone agreed to. It was a decision that was made, and then after it was made, basically, it was something that everyone accepted. I think that, and that we live with, or that basically, even within protests to it and so forth, as occurred, as I was involved with in the 80s. But what strikes me as interesting and very important about your remark is something that I made, is that it is the tendency for us to see this system constantly at the edge, always, of collapse. And yet our response to it is that there is a way of living life that continues to go on at that edge. And we keep on pushing that edge further out. The other side of that, though, I would return to again underline the fact that for many populations of the world, that decision is not, that's not a decision that they're making. They're living on a different kind of edge, which is the edge of constant war and civil wars, and a greater space or zones of civil war that are flashing everywhere around the world. I don't see these two edges, let's say, or these two horizons as unrelated. We may feel it as a state of insecurity, but as a zone of relative peace. But other populations feel it as a state of constant danger and threat and death. So I would return to Hobbes, and this returns to the individual will, the gentleman who first asked the question. Hobbes said, look, the basis for sovereignty is the individual, Mrs. Spinoza said this too, the individual's decision to give up their own right of violence to the state or to another or to the sovereign, to use only to protect their life, okay? Now this is a classical image of sovereignty, but Hobbes said this is what creates in any form of sovereignty, in any state form, and Spinoza said it even best, that power is always indefinite, and basically anyone at any moment can always make the decision to take that power back. And the fear of the state, this is, Hobbes had this beautiful image, is that the state, the monarchy, at that time as Hobbes was writing, lives in a constant state of indigestion, is what he said. Its intestinal tract is poisoned by its own fear of the decision that is imminent always in the people or in the populace or in the crowd. And so in a sense, that form of decision is there too.
Yeah, we're out of time here because we have to leave this room by 7 o'clock. So please join me in thanking Gregg Lambert for the